It's an honor for me to be here and have the opportunity to talk to you about, I think it's a very important issue related to urban transport and urban mobility as in general. I will start my presentation showing this picture. What this tells us? It's interesting because this is the Vitruvian Man. It's a draw from Leonardo da Vinci. And this guy lived in a period in time which is very similar to the period we are living today. It was a very disruptive moment in history. It was the Renaissance. And in the Renaissance, we have this main disruption in terms of how things were coming or how they were developing and how they start to change from that period in time. Then we have these new discoveries, a huge movement and disruptive movements in arts, and Leonardo is one of these examples, Raphael and others. Improvements in health, wealth, education. There was the discoveries. Columbus discovered America, and then after that, the Americas with all the discoveries. And all the things became to change. But then we have also the creation of the printing press, which can be compared with what is happening right now with the internet and all the access to information we have. Just to remember, in the Renaissance, what we had, it was a very small group of people that could read and could have access to information. But then, with this disruptive innovation called the printing press, the access to information was available to everybody. Of course, the increasing literate people start to read, learn to read. This spread a lot of new ideas and a lot of different and innovative, innovative issues became to happen. But at the same time that you have this improvement, substantial improvement in quality of life, technology, and all this stuff, we also have some problems related to new disease that this time happens in both sides of the world, the new discovery Americas and Europe and Asia, but new disease, and mainly inequality became to happen perhaps more dramatically than in the past, because we have these new technologies, this new understanding of how the world is working, and most people became not accessing to these new facilities, which in some sense is not very different what is happening right now in our world. But then, besides that, we have intellectual innovation, but then I was talking about the trade, the migration, and social friction, which I think is also very similar to what is going on right now. Okay, but what we have learned, what we can get from this experience, which is very similar to the one we are experiencing today, is that individuals and societies need to be very smart and very well organized to become winners. This, I think, is a major point that I'm going to explore during my presentation today. People need to take risks and stay open to new ideas, shaping dynamic cities. And when we talk about that, of course, we have to get the idea of sustainable urban mobility, which is a major force driving dynamism of modern cities, but its provision is a multidimensional problem. And this, I think, is a major issue to be explored. I got some ideas from Brenda Pereira. She's here today. And her doctoral thesis, which I had the privilege of being her supervisor, she analyzed complex systems, complex problems, using a methodology proposed by some guys, and the model is called Stakeholder Value Network methodology, SVN, and she used that approach to develop a model to understand the different stakeholders that are part of the public transport problem. In other words, we have to look at the different stakeholders in order to be successful in implementing any problem. I got some experience, practical experience, as transport secretary in a medium-sized city, 1.5 million inhabitants, Porto Alegre, in the state southernmost state in Brazil, and we try to do some projects, implement some projects, and sometimes, because we did not treat properly all the stakeholders involved in that process, the result could be a failure. And I have some practical experience of that. We had a very big and very nice, very technical project, very good project, but unfortunately, we couldn't make it through, make it real, because we didn't take into account properly all the stakeholders. And this, I think, is a major issue when we are talking about providing and making change, or trying to make changes, change our environment. Then I got this image, which I think is very interesting. But look, then we have this vision, skills, incentives, resource, action plan in order to get change. But if you do not have all these dimensions, in this case, there is a smiling face here saying, oh, look, the change happens. But if, for instance, there is no vision, we have the skills, incentives, resource, action plan, but you have confusion. If you do not have the skills, even if you have the vision, incentives, resource, action, what it provides, the end of this history, is anxiety, and so on. Here you have gradual change if you do not have the right incentives, which I think this is a major point. The right incentives. We cannot expect the answer that you are asking for if you do not provide the right incentives to people act in the way you want to do, they do. If you do not have the resource, this is frustration. I experienced that in real life when I was transport secretary, because sometimes nice plans, good ideas, nice people work on it, but we do not have enough money, for instance, to do what we have to do. And sometimes we have the money, but the problem is people with high skills, and then so on. And this I like this. If you do not have a bússola, an action plan, you have all the other dimensions, but this is going, actually what is going to produce is a false start. My objective today is to analyze urban mobility and some key issues driving changes that impact the implementation of sustainable transport. I think this is interesting, which I think is what the WRI is in the main directives of WRI, which is to approach the complex issues, counting, changing, or count it, change it, and scale it. In some sense, what I'm going to do is follow this directive through these contents. Then the idea today is to present a first part is the count, which is the problem identification. Then there is the change itself, which in some sense is related how to change the future or how to provide a better future. How to scale it, considering a non-industry approach. I will explore this a lot. Is economics in the basis of everything, every sustainable thing. And these I'm going to explore. And finally, I will show some of what I understand are the main remarks or main issues to be explored from all this discussion. When talking about counted, I will analyze through these 4 dimensions. The first one is forests and the cities. Forest is the base for our oxygen and get a good part of the carbon we put on the atmosphere. Then there is the energy and urban development, technology issues, and some politics and governance. Forests and cities. First of all, I think there is no sense in talking into how to preserve forests without considering what is going on in the cities and vice versa. Then, why? Because the consumption are mainly, the forest products are mainly part of the city's consumption. And today the world is becoming urban. Especially if you talk about the BRIC countries or developing countries and other emerging countries, what we have is the population mainly concentrated on cities. And then there is this synergy to be explored. Then the urban inhabitants, they are part of the solution for the forest. They have to be absolutely convinced that forests are important, that the products consumption from the forest have to be on a sustainable way. But first of all, they have the vote power. Then suppose the following situation. You will have nice plans for the forest, for instance, but the cities, the people that actually vote, which are around 80%, 85% of the population, like in Brazil, live in cities. If they are not absolutely convinced that this is important, they are going to vote in someone, parties, which they do not believe that forests have to be preserved, for instance. Then I think this is a link, synergy, which is a main point to be explored and considered when we are talking about sustainability as a whole, and even sustainability at the urban level. The second point here, when we are talking about count, is the energy and the urban development. Of course, energy is a major issue or a major raw material, let's say, for urban development. It's essential. But at the same time, it's the raw material for transport, for industrial and commercial activities, buildings, infrastructure, water distribution, food production, etc. Always this issue needs a lot of energy. And the link between sustainable transport and urban development and energy is that the cities need energy. They require constant supply of energy, but sometimes we do not have the proper planning at the city level in terms of organizing the city and at the same time thinking about where the energy comes from and how it's going to be consumed at the urban level. Urban sprawl, increasing distance between destinations, and inefficient public transport systems, which are a reality, especially in developing world, lead to overall reliance on private motorized transport. High energy consumption is a consequence mostly from petroleum, from oil. The next stage, next dimension, is technology. And this, I think, is another major issue, like the others. But particularly this issue today is a very challenging one, especially when we talk about a lot of new developments happening exactly in the transport sector. And in some sense, we have a kind of distance between what the technology is proposing and how the cities are being managed. For instance, new technologies, sometimes, if you talk about a city, a developed city, a sustainable city, an organized city, the impact of this technology there is completely different of the impact of this new technology in a very disorganized city, in a city that sometimes they do not have even the most basic conditions like reasonable pavement in the road or signs at the road and streets, etc. Then we have this increasing urbanization. Oh, this is an affirmation that I think is very interesting. Increasing urbanization does not necessarily mean less sustainable transport. On the contrary. But the basic point here is that you can have a large city, but planning and control is a basic issue. If you do not have that, then we have some situations like you can observe, especially in underdeveloped countries, which is a kind of mess, complete mess, because there is no planning at all. Or even sometimes you have the plan, you have the master plan, but it is not followed in real world. And then this is a big, it's important issue. Now you have this situation that technologies and big data should be servants. But in some time or some case, they are also the master. This is a new way of seeing things. For instance, in terms of logistics, in terms of the smart city itself, transport schemes are less about technology and more about people and policies. Then we have this kind of new opportunities, new technologies being provided, but to have, it's absolutely necessary that you have also smart people taking decisions. Smart city, smart people. This is a basic link to be established. A major trend in sustainable city transport is the rise of the e-mobility. Well, this is, there is no question about it. But at the same time, it's not just about finding more efficient ways to power vehicles, but needs to reduce traffic and energy use. And this, in order to get this, we have to be, or to have smart decisions, rational choices, which is the title of my presentation today. Well, then we have this, if you are going to move towards a new smart cities, we have to take into account some important issues. For instance, to develop integrated mobility platforms, which is the basic for this smart city, requires negotiation of a complex web of relationships, the stakeholders, Brenda's stakeholders, with the relevant public and private stakeholders in the mobility ecosystem. Then we have all these kinds of things: mobility service operators, motorized, individual, public, non-motorized, stationary. All these things have to be worked together. And then when you talk about smart cities, when you talk about platforms, there is some kind of confusion, which I think happens in all discussions I have following throughout the world. For instance, if by one side we want more freedom, more competition, freedom to compete, by the other side we have the need to control, the need of a center planning in order to put all these things working together. And I think this is a major challenge that we have to face in the next years, the next steps of the development of urban mobility. System integrators, system integration providers are part of this complex issue that have to work in these platforms. Data provision providers, end user equipment providers, and basically value-added providers. Next item, politics and governance, another major issue. What we need it's a framework to understand connection between leadership, institutions, governance, public policies in the transport sector. All the things are linked and are part of the smart decisions. Major innovations in transport result from the emergence of a mode of governance that profoundly transforms the way urban transport is planned and implemented in terms of scale, modes, and collective actions, which is a network of actors. And then there is the thing which I think is the classical example. Classical now, although it's a very recent fact considering history, but there is the Bogota Transmilenio, which is benchmark for everybody. Now everybody knows about it. Then there is the idea of well-being, aiming at improving quality of life in a major city in Latin America. With the leadership of the mayor, which is a reference for everybody, Peñalosa, which made great strides towards improving urban mobility. What you have to take very carefully about it is continuity. In democratic countries, which is part of what we want for our countries, for the world, in democratic countries, power change, the command change. And then the main point here is how to provide an institutional upgrade. How to make that people, the inhabitants, the voters, the consumers, and the authorities understand that institutionally this is a good thing. Because the leadership, I think, the champion, it's very important. But if you depend only on the champion, you have the risk that the next mayor, for instance, can be somebody who simply say, look, forget about it. And then the improvements that you get can go back. And in some cities, you can see it very clearly. Then you have some advance and some go back to the start and go again. And the result, if you look in time, is that we stay in the same time, same point. Then I think this is a major issue. How to make that change institutional, independently of who is sitting in the power seat. Then I finish the first part, the count it. And I start to talk a little bit about change it. What is that? I was part of a very interesting project. It was published by Grande Corporation. It was developed by IfMo, Institute for Mobility. It's an institute linked to the BMW. They used to think about the future. And this, I think, is it's a really very interesting study. I had the privilege of participating on that study, and I was responsible for the Brazilian data and Brazilian analysis. But the main point here was trying to understand what is going to happen with automobility in the future. Then we got these BRIC countries. South Africa was not part of Brazil, Russia, India, and China. And trying to understand the major or the main indicators, the main indexes that you have right now, and what can be the development. The main question here was, are these countries follow the same path that the developed world followed? This was the main question. Then we got data from the BRIC countries and data from for developed countries, Australia, Germany, United States, and Japan. And we try to compare this information. And the result was something like that. Look, much probably, the BRIC countries will, automobility indexes or indicators will fall between those of the United States, which have the highest per capita vehicle kilometers traveled, and the Japan, which has the lowest. It's something like this. But each country, each one of these BRIC countries, probably will reach this, what they call saturation level of automobility in different periods in time. Then I just got two examples here in order to illustrate what I'm saying. It's very interesting. Then we have, for instance, Australia, when this is we are talking about the strength of domestic car, right? Then we have in the 1910s in Australia, it starts up to 1990s. In Germany, from the 50s to 2000. In Japan, from 60s to the 90s. United States, it's interesting. It's reducing right now because the strength of the car from the 1910s and to the 80s. Brazil is from the 80s, and probably by 2030 we are going to get the saturation, right? If nothing is done, if the path, the trend is the same. China, from 20s to 2020s. India, from the 10s to 2040s. And finally, Russia, which Russia is interesting because Russia, it's an old country, population age is high, but it's a little bit, it's an European country with some BRIC countries characteristics at the same time. And the other example is the adoption pro-car policies, which is very pragmatic. It's what happened right now. This is going to be changed. We have to change that. Then, for instance, in Australia, the pro-car policy started in the 10s, and in the 90s, it became the steady state, let's say. From there, they start to realize, well, we have to establish that, at least to establish, or perhaps to reduce these policies. At the same time, in Germany, also from the 50s into 2000s, it started they realized that. United States, to the 80s. In Brazil, we have this different flow. It was in the 80s, it started very huge, very strong policies, pro-car. And probably the saturation level is going to be reached by 2030s. In China, in the 20s, was very high now, and it's expected that it's going to be in 2030, the stabilization point. In India to 2040, and in Russia to 2030. What I think the main point this tells us is that if the car, we have to reduce, especially in the BRIC countries, to reduce this time. Because in some of them, we are still going no backwards. We're still going on in something that's going to be reduced. We are improving something that's going to need to be reduced. Then I think it's very important. That's why I brought this to you today. And then we have the third moment, which is scale it. Then I'm going to talk about some externalities of urban mobility and motorized transport. The idea of networks. This is another main issue. Everywhere where I go talk to transport, I say, I cannot talk about transport without talking about network. I learned that in Harvard, in a very short course I did that, which is just 1 month, but I think it was brilliant. It's a course called Infrastructure in a Market Economy. And the idea is to understand how infrastructure as a whole, it doesn't matter if it's energy, water, sanitation, anyway, even health, have to be treated as network. And network systems have different approach. If you do not understand that, I think we can sometimes thinking that we are improving things, we are contributing towards some situations. Because network is different. And we have all the economic justification, all the economic analysis or tools are already available to understand how networks work, how they have to be treated. And then I will talk very briefly about economy of scale, scope, and what I call network integrity, and something about public-private partnerships. Well, when we talk about externalities, then, for instance, first point is need to charge by social costs. I think everybody knows about it. Transport produce externalities, greenhouse gas emissions, local air pollution, accidents, and increasing travel time. And some policy instruments to address these negative externalities from urban road transport are fiscal instruments, congestion charges, vehicle taxes, fuel taxes, yeah? Congestion charges are road pricing and things like that. Subsidies for clean fuels and vehicles, just to give some examples of externalities. And then we have this, which I think is very interesting, the vicious cycle of urban decline. Yeah? There is the typical, this figure for urban transport. I just got a study from the guys from Australia, I don't remember exactly who, but I also, after that I can say exactly who provided this figure. I think it's very interesting, this figure, because it amplified the idea for vicious cycle for urban decline, which start for more traffic produce buses and trams, public transport, running slower, less effective, and therefore much less attractive. And this is decrease the use of public transport, decrease the public transport offer, which is require more investment. The idea, this move people to use cars. But also there are some impacts of this vicious cycle in terms of urban development itself. Because the increasing of air pollution, the city becomes less pleasant to live in, and the inner city residential areas decline. This is very typical. In my city, for instance, the inner city center declined a lot, and today there are lots of problems associated with security and things like that. All of things caused by that. And at the same time, you have this other path. The urban employment areas are less accessible. Employment possibilities move from the city to the outskirts. Then all the things, it's a very linked issues, are very linked issues, which have to be avoided. William Baumol, an amazing economist, which unfortunately died last year, he developed a theory, or a way of thinking, called the coast disease. What is the coast disease? He says that most sectors at the urban level, not the only urban level, but focusing on urban level, they have strong, very huge gains in productivity. But others do not. And unfortunately, public transport is one of these examples in that the gains in productivity and in efficiency is not happening in the way they have to. And then there is a very interesting situation. Because if you live in a city, in some sectors, improve a lot the efficiency. The result of this improvement is that people start to have a rise in payments. Salaries became higher. But the other sectors say, look, if this sector has a lower efficiency, then say, look, if that guy, for instance, the computer areas, computer technology, etc. People say, look, I have to earn the same salary than these guys. But the point is, we do not have gains in productivity in this case. And if you increase salaries here, the actual result, is that you become less productive and less attractive as a system to attract people from the cars, for instance. Then I think it's a major problem, this one. Then the idea is that, he says, the economy can be divided in two sectors. A progressive one, which is, for example, computer and other areas which are experiencing very high levels of efficiency increase, and some stagnant sectors, which unfortunately, public transport is one example. And I can quote you two examples. One is that in most Latin American cities, especially in Brazilian cities, which is a reality I know a little bit more, still have the cash. The guy who asks for people, the money from the people, yeah. I just forgot the name in English. But the guy who asks for money, the fair cashier or something like that. Well, this is an example. And I was reading the New York Times 2 weeks ago, and they are rising. The point there is that the metro, the New York City metro, still have something like 3,000 or 2,500 people who are like the fair cashier, but they work with arms, because in the start of when the metro started working, I think it was the end of 19th century or beginning of the 20th century, all the payments were made through coins and money. But today, we have something like 85% of the payments are electronic ticketing. And then, but the number of people are the same from the start of the last century, which is in some sense reflects that we do not include the gains in productivity that technology was made available for the system. Network and urban transport. As I said before, network is a basic issue. If you do not talk about transport, you taking into account or taking as a basic assumption that is a network infrastructure, then we can have some disequilibrium. The point here is that networks must be in equilibrium. Then you have the demand, which are people needing mobility, need to move, and there are the set. This is important. The set of modes, alternatives, which have to be available for this guy. They have to be in equilibrium. If not, you can have queues, or you can have shortage, of services. What if, this is just to give a pause, the Roman Empire had managed to build a continent-spanning transit system? I'm fascinated by the Roman Empire. I think it's one of the major developments we have in human development. But this I think is very interesting. Actually, they did. This is a map provided by a young guy from the University of Chicago. I got it, he produced that, this map, and he represents the road network in the 2nd century as an underground map. I think this is interesting because the idea of network was there already 2,000 years ago. Economy. We have now the new economy models. We're talking all the time about new developments, new economy, sharing economy, etc. And I got this, I think there is some confusion about what is that. When people talk about some Uber, Cabify, and all these new developments we are experiencing today. Then there is, this was published by the World Economic Forum 2 weeks or 3 weeks ago. And then they gave some definitions, which I think it's very interesting to fully and clearly understand what these things really are. Right? Then we have this collaborative economy. I will just read here. It's very briefly, I promise you. Then we have this sharing economy, which is, the idea is sharing of underutilized assets, monetized or not, in ways that improve efficiency, sustainability, and community. The second definition, collaborative economy. The idea is focus on collaborative forms of consumption, production, financing, and learning, which I think is interesting. Then there is this on-demand economy. Look, all of these are part of the sharing economy, but they have specificities which must have to be properly considered. On-demand economy, focus on demand. For instance, immediate and access-based provision of goods and services. The gig economy, focus on workforce participation and income generation via gigs, simple projects or tasks for which a worker is hired. Freelance economy, which is, for me, was something new. Focus on the workforce participation and income generation by freelancers. peer economy, focus on peer-to-peer, P2P, networks in the creation of products, delivery of services, funding, and more. Access economy, focus on access over ownership. Crowd economy, focus on economic models powered by crowd, including but not limited to crowdsourcing and crowdfunding. Digital economy, focus on anything powered by digital technologies. And finally, platform economy, focus on anything powered by tech-centric platforms. It's entirely possible that one platform can fall under multiple definitions. I think this is important because this new economy is part of the economic issues that are facing sustainable urban mobility. When we talk then about economy, not only the sharing economy, but to have also some important issues here. Transport is conceived as a network, as I said before. But as network, there are some particularities common for to infrastructure industries in general. Economies of scale, which are linked to the network economy or the network framework. Economies of scales, which means if you produce more, you can produce in a lower cost per unit. Economy of scope, and this is a major issue, especially in developing countries, which means you produce more than one product or you have different levels of demand. Then we have these things related to economy of scope. Joint production, sharing costs, and cross-subsidy. The idea of cross-subsidy is a reality in most countries, in most cities. In my city, which I will give just an example, then we have, for instance, people that live closer to the CBD area. There is a correlation between proximity of that and income levels. Then people, the income levels are higher for people living closer to that area and lower for people living in more distant areas. And then they use there an average price. Is a price for all the network, the same price, which means a cross-subsidy. In some sense, people living close to the CBD area, they are paying higher fares than people living far from the CBD area, which means people with a higher level of income are subsidizing people with lower high. This is a policy. I do not answer the question if it's about social justice or if it's good or bad. I'm saying that this is a policy instrument, is a possibility. And for a basic point for that is treating transport as a network. And then there is this economies of network integrity. In some sense, we are saying there are gains for controlling and enlarging networks. And most of these scale and scope economies are part of this integrity. But in some sense, this is linked to what I told you before, that if you are going to have some kind of control of the network, then costs are expected to be lower than you do not have. At the same time, when you talk about economy, economies of scale, scope, etc., we are necessarily have to talk a little bit about regulation. Regulation is a major issue. From my experience as director of a major regulatory agency at federal level in Brazil, I got experience of regulating network, rail, all considered to private sector. It's a very tough, very difficult issue. It's a very task, let's say. It's a very difficult task to regulate because there is, it's a game, and you have to control, you have to not control sometimes, but you have to be very, very careful about keeping what is defined in a contract. In most Latin American and African countries, for instance, just to give some examples, there are no contracts. There is no cash flow. There is no idea of project finance. When we talk about sustainability, in economic terms, if you forget about that, you are just probably going to one of that dimensions I presented to you. You have a lot of wishful thinking, but you are not going to implement that project because there is the lack of proper economic consideration. And I assure you, for instance, in Brazil right now, there is how to say, well, a lot of initiative to provide bidding process for people taking, gaining the control to operate the public bus services, for instance. And in most cases, the guys who won the bidding process are the same guys that used to operate before. You know why? Simply because they treat the business, even the public power, even the conceding, the government, they treat as a regular business. They are not talking about the public service and the network service. And when they do that, they didn't understand that it's necessary to have a period of time, let's say 20 years, 10 years, I don't know, depends. Yeah? But then you have to have this cash flow. What investments you have to do? What is the revenue? What is the payback period? What is net present value, and things like that. But mainly, if you can go to the market, ask for money from banks and other, the exchange market, for instance, get money from there and pay back with the future revenue. This is usual in all other infrastructures, like energy, telecommunication, etc. And unfortunately, in terms of management, governance, we are very, very primitive, let's say. Right? And finally, about this topic, all this discussion starts when I was doing my PhD in Leeds. I had the privilege of reading the manuscript from Chadwick. Chadwick was he's not a statistician, I think. He was a statistician. In 1869, he provided the basis to understand why, in some case, you cannot have competition in the market. You need to have competition for the market. In for is a complete different question, leads to complete different questions, different solutions. If you do not understand that, what we can do is practicing some mistakes. This is, of course, have to be is valid for all modes. And I promise I will show you very briefly this next image. This is a bike graveyard in China. The Guardian published this a few weeks ago. I don't know if it's true, but I've seen this picture. And this is the result of lack of control. The problems that we are facing with cars can happen to other modes. If you do not take it properly, if you do not understand economically the basis of what we are doing, you can make the same mistakes with what we believe is the solution. The last question here, we have to move from a cost-based pricing to a value-based pricing. This is another major difference, major innovation, let's say, that we have to provide at the urban level. It's just a matter of, it's not just a matter of how much it costs and ask people to pay. We have to depart from what the price, what is the willingness to pay. More in developing countries, we have to talk about the viability to pay. And from that, we have to provide. And being absolutely efficient in providing that. To finish my presentation, I will talk about what I understand are the main lessons that you have to learn to properly tackle, to properly face the problems associated with urban mobility. And I hire this quotation by this Brazilian writer, Chico Xavier. He used to say, although no one can go back and make a new start, anyone can start now and make a new ending. I think this is very emblematic quotation which I think is based to the main points I will raise here, the main lessons. Evolution results from a combination of incremental and disruptive moments. Sometimes disruptions, but most times incremental. This is interesting because if you just start to produce disruptive moments in place where they are still in the point where no eruption, I don't know if the word exists, is even in place. It can be a leapfrog, I don't know. There are some good examples of leapfrog, which results in reverse innovation, which I think is a term very interesting. And by the way, I think the BRTs is a kind of reverse innovation. Buses were developed in the first world, then they went to the developing world, received a large investment instead of creativity, and now they are spread all over the world, including some developed countries, which I think this is a very good example. It does not make sense to keep complaining about past unsustainable choices. Well, unfortunately, this is also reality. What you can do from now. Of course, these unsustainable choices create poverty, which is our major enemy to be defeated, inequality, pollution, and at the end, unhappiness. Need excessive programs of capacitation of technical staff from municipalities, especially in developing and emerging countries. Look, if you talk about smart cities, it's impossible to talk no smart people taking the decisions. Unfortunately, this is very problematic. I think perhaps it's one of the most important problems when we are talking about solving or trying to improve quality of urban transport in developing countries. To treat urban mobility as an industry, unfortunately, is a kind of handcraft. We produce transport as something to be sold as a unit, not using scale and not using all the economies we talked before. A shift from cost-based pricing to transport safety to value-based pricing, I mentioned here. Cities in developing and emerging countries are facing what I call the great paradox of working to provide more public transport and increase its market share, while car consumption and motorization indexes are still far below those in the developed world, which is part of the study we did with the Institute for Mobility. Okay, and finally, just to finish, sustainable mobility for all can be achieved. I have no doubt about it. But it's necessary making rational choices and adopting robust and pragmatic initiatives. If you want to read more about today's presentation, and also a paper I write, especially for this presentation today, you can just get this QR code, and then you can access both the presentation and the paper. Thank you very much. To talk about how to implement things, of course, the first point is clearly understand what is going on there. I think there is no standard. There is no standard that can be applied everywhere. Yeah, but then I think the first point is clearly understand. When we talk about clearly understand the stakeholders, I think for any action, and I think this can be used everywhere, the first point is really understand who are the main guys or the main groups, the representative of the main groups, to clearly understand what they want, what are their expectations, and put all this thing together. When I talk then about the model for understanding the stakeholders, it's about that. And I think because if you clearly understand that, you can identify why the project can go ahead or not. I will give you an example that I experienced as transport secretary. We created a project called City Portals, Portais da Cidade, which had the support from WRI in the 2006 or 2007, right? The project was fascinating. The idea is to introduce a BRT. We already have some buses running in special ways, in corridors, special corridors, dedicated lanes. And then the idea, and because the buses, they stop, the bus lane stop close to the city center area. Then the buses go and it becomes a mess there. The bus, instead of being the solution, is part of the problem because pollution, congestion, etc. Then the idea was to link the different corridors coming from different parts of the city with some tunnels, nice buses, well, something like the Transmillennium applied to Porto Alegre. The technical project was very good. We had the money, but we do not have the opposition parties. The opposition party, although they are minority, but they made a lot of noise that they make the project not viable. We couldn't go ahead with the project. Then look, it was not the main part of that complex problem, but they avoided that the project was implemented. Even today, it did went ahead. On the other side, at the same level, there was some project being proposed by the state and the federal government, which was something over the same project, using similar, the same streets, same avenues, which was the idea to implement a metro. Look, the metro costs something like $100 million US dollars per kilometer, or something like that. And the city had no money to keep on a reasonable way the bus system, which is much less expensive than the metro. But because this political discussion, these very good projects, the opposition parties, plus the project by the federal and state level, they became enemy of the project. Then what I could suggest is taking into account very carefully any initiative. I know, because I'm a technical guy, that we become in love with our projects. But who really have to be in love with our project is the population. And most times we have these nice projects. And then my recommendation would be take into account the stakeholders, all of them. And as in the doctoral thesis there, of course, some of them are heavier than others. You have to identify how powerful each of these stakeholders are. Yeah? But this is absolutely essential. I don't know if I answered your question, but I think I would recommend that. Thank you. But, my thesis was trying to estimate the value of travel time, in the case variability, the willingness to pay. Look, I heard a lot about subsidies. I think subsidy is a good discussion when they talk about, well, look, my budget, I have to give back money to the taxpayers. But this is not reality. I think perhaps one or two countries in the world can do that. But if you talk about poor countries, or even the BRIC countries, or even some developed countries, the subsidy has to be from somewhere. If it does come from the transport itself, then it has to come from health, or housing, or education. I don't know. When I was transport secretary, I was asking for all the money possible for me because I have to do a lot of improvements. And I say, look, I need subsidies. Okay? I need to improve the quality service of transport service, but people cannot pay the costs. Then give me some money, and they say the mayor say, look, forget about it. I do not have money to do all the things I have to do. I always prefer what I call self-sustainable services. And even because sometimes, perhaps the idea is not to give them the best bus you can give them with air conditioner, seats, like, I don't know, but sophisticated seats. But when I talk about the value added, as I say, what is your willingness to pay? Because I have worked a lot with this stuff in Latin America and some other countries, always trying to understand what is the willingness to pay. There are a lot of instruments to estimate that, to do some stated preference surveys or any contract analysis, anything like that, get the idea, estimate the model, and then you know how much they are willing to pay. I confess you, I have traveling all over the world, talking about transport, learning about transport, writing about transport. Always I heard, we have to give subsidies. And the point I always ask them, okay, no problem, where the money comes from. And if you have a sustainable, from economic point of view, fare, or which people can afford to pay, and if you put a lot of efficiency providing the service, then you can have the lower, because efficiency is produce more with lower costs. This is efficiency. And if you do that, you are going to attract people. And they are going to pay, even because sometimes the willingness to pay is not equal to ability to pay. Sometimes people, and this is another experience I got from my practical experience. Sometimes people are dependent on public transport. And if they are willing to pay, it's not a problem of availability to pay, but they are willing to pay. They want a little bit more. They are willing to sacrifice some other expenses in order to put in transport. Yeah? But then this is the departure point. But we are, I think we are very accustomed. How to say that?
Accustomed.
Yes. Well, this one. Yeah. To just say, because I think this is a very, very government point of view. Say, look, let's provide this. This is good for people. This is a very technical view. I think we have to mix all the things, you know? And then you say, look, let's ask people. Let's ask them what they want. But, and translate that into a very practical actions. This, I think, is an example. What is the willingness to pay? And then you say, look, if they can pay or they are willing to pay that, I cannot provide a service which is twice what they are willing to pay. Because if you do not do that, any other innovation, any Uber, Cabify, anything like that, enter, of course they're going to use the market share because they're departing from the willingness to pay. I don't know if I'm prepared to answer with quality your question, because then I think Peñalosa is going to ask me to go there. And look, I think as far as I know, the problem of Bogota, of Transmillennium, is part of, because of what I say. I think the project was much more ambitious than the stage it is right now. Because there are some guys, some other mayors or something like that, it seems like they dislike or are not so favorable to Transmillennium. Then I think the development didn't happen like it should be. Yeah? Okay, then now we are now right in this moment. What would be my advice? Yeah? I continue to say, ask people how much they can pay. The size of the subsidy, I'm not against subsidies. What I'm saying is that subsidy should not be the first action, right? You have to try to explore all other options before. Okay, But for poor people, I think there is no other possibility than subsidies, right? But even if the richer people are not using, well, by the way, rich people do not use public transport here in Europe as well, right? What uses the middle class or the upper middle class at most. But the idea is that trying to understand the willingness to pay, because probably there is some kind of, I don't know how the fares are established there. I'm not aware about that. But what I see, I worked in the very beginning of the Transmillennium trying to understand demand as part of my consultant activities there by that time. Yeah. But one problem that we identify when we were starting that, because sometimes some projects pay the price of its success, which I think is then there are just two things: the price of the success, a lot of people using the system, and by the other side, the discontinuity that, as far as I know, happens in the Transmillennium because of other mayor anyway. Yeah, but I don't know. Perhaps this is a good question to people who are working on it. Is what is the willingness to pay? Probably is less than is being charged, isn't it? Especially for this segment of the demand. I don't know if you answered. I'm sorry, but this is a very tough question.
Thank you very much, Senna.
So thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much.